Hello and welcome to Field Interference. This is your host, Ryan G. Today I will be talking about anti-gravity propulsion and field effects. On the line with me is Andrew Johnson from checktheevidence.com to discuss his research into the field of electrogravitics. Hi Andrew, glad to have you back on the show.
Hi Ryan, thanks for inviting me back on.
And I wanted to speak specifically about this presentation I found from you. It's called The Case for Anti-Gravity. You discussed prominent figures in history that have researched anti-gravity, like Thomas Townsend Brown and John Hutchison. I was wondering, what was it that originally captured your interest in anti-gravity research?
Well, I think, as I've said a number of times on interviews, my interest has been, sort of lifelong, I suppose, in one sense. But what really sort of focused that interest more acutely was this disclosure project which Stephen Greer had put together, and he'd had this big press conference in Washington, D.C., and if people have not familiarised themselves with that, I think it's a very worthwhile exercise to actually go and watch those videos. Stephen Greer has recently recycled a lot of these videos into this Serious Disclosure website, and he's put many of them, if not all of them, on YouTube, so they're all free to watch. And there's some very compelling testimony, some of which, for example, talks about people being involved in black projects that were allegedly reverse engineering this technology which had been, retrieved from crashed disks and so on. One witness is called Bill Uhouse. He's the one that comes to mind. And of course, Colonel Philip J. Corso is another person that's alleged to have been involved in sort of dishing out some of this technology which was recovered in the Roswell crash. And Corso wrote about that in his book, The Day After Roswell. But it appears that if you go back to the early 1900s, there seems to be some sort of anti-gravity research was going on, in the white world outside of all of that. And, I talk about that a little bit in this presentation that I'd originally put together in 2004 as a result of finding some of this, testament in the Disclosure Project. And that was the starting point, really.
So, what is anti-gravity? We know that gravity is the g-force. It is known as a measurement of acceleration felt as weight. It can also be described as weight per unit mass. So some people would argue that a chair is anti-gravity or that a jet is anti-gravity. But what would you define anti-gravity to be?
Yeah, that's right. That's what I tried to put in my presentation, which was because of a sort of not an argument, but a discussion I was having with a friend. I mean, something like a rigid structure doesn't actually change or modify the local force of gravity, it just resists the force of gravity. So I wouldn't really call that anti-gravity. I mean, if you had the idea of having an anti-gravity device is that, for instance, you could switch it on, and then maybe objects near to it would levitate, and apparently lose their weight. And yet you quite rightly pointed out the difference between mass and weight, which is something that one of the things you learn early on in physics classes, that mass is essentially a measure of how much material is there, and weight is what is caused by the effect of gravity on that mass. So you get into those concepts. But yeah, anti-gravity is essentially something which would allow the weight to be changed without the mass changing. And a jet engine, for example, works on what's essentially a version of Archimedes' principle, where you displace mass from one place to another and thereby generate lift and or thrust. And most of the conventional technology that we have operates on a similar principle. A hot air balloon is Archimedes' principle, and essentially something like an ion thruster is really, kinetic energy device in terms of it ejects molecules at high speed from a thruster. So these are not really anti-gravity devices in the sense that I would define them.
Well, I would say that one particularly good example of anti-gravity is a experiment by George S. Pigott in July 1920. He designed, built, and utilized a potent electrostatic machine with which he observed powerful electrogravitic effects. Mr. Pigott was able to suspend heavy silver beads, 112 inches in diameter, and other materials in the air space between a charged sphere and a concave ground plate when his generator was fully charged at 500,000 electrostatic volts. The levitational feat was known as the Pigott effect. George Pigott was using electrostatic devices that were quite advanced for his time, and he was creating levitation of small beads. We've seen the same with John Hutchison, and I wanted to ask you, what do you think about Thomas Townsend Brown and his experiments?
Yeah, well, that's very interesting, Ryan, because I wasn't that familiar with George Pigott's experiments. Obviously, I know they're in Dr. Judy Wood's book, and she probably goes into more detail there than we discussed in person. She mentioned some of that research, which I wasn't familiar with. But going on from that, it does sound very similar to what Thomas Townsend Brown was doing in terms of, the general name of it is electrogravitics, as I think you mentioned there, or we got close to that definition, where by using high voltage electricity in a number of ways, it appears that you can actually change the force of gravity on an object and get it to lose weight. And so Thomas Townsend Brown, he was basically an experimental physicist, and he was, I think, originally from Ohio. He was born in Ohio, but he worked at Caltech. He studied at Caltech and Kenyon College and Denison University. He's something of a physicist, but probably more of an experimental physicist or an electrical engineer. And he was in the Navy in the 1930s, and of course he worked at the Naval Research Laboratory. And then one of the things which it comes up when you look at his research, which started off actually with a chap called Biefeld, who was he was a contemporary of Einstein. He was a friend of Einstein, was Paul Biefeld, and they did some experiments in the 20s with gravitators, and they found this interaction between electric charge and the force of gravity, similar to obviously what George Pigott seemed to have been doing. I don't know whether they'd come across Pigott's research or whether they discovered this independently, but it sounds as if they discovered it independently, because the original way that they came upon this effect was when they were actually doing experiments with X-ray tubes. And with X-ray tubes, as you perhaps realise, again, this is something you need high voltage for. You need to go above 25 kilovolts approximately before you start getting X-rays coming out of your tube, that can be charged up. And you use large capacitors as well. And what they were noticing, that when they were switching the voltage through these tubes, they would actually jerk around somewhat, or they would move excessively. And they began to investigate why this was, and they found out that you could charge up a capacitor and it would lose weight. And I talk about this in this presentation that I did. I'm just about 10 years old now, and again, this is something that is worth looking into and is discussed in Nick Cook's book, The Hunt for Zero Point, which was published in year 2000, and you can get PDFs of that if you look. If you poke around on the internet, you'll find a PDF of that. And recommend it's a good read, that book of Nick Cook's research. He was a former editor of Jane's Defence Weekly. I think he still works for Jane's Defence Weekly, and he goes to all these conferences and exhibitions where defence technology, or mainly aerospace defence technology, I should say, is actually shown and discussed. But I must point out that I did have some communication with Nick Cook, albeit fairly brief, and around about 2006, I think it was, he seemed to just fade away almost, and I last heard him on a Radio 4 program. I'll just try and check the date on that, but I think it was sometime in around about 2008, and he seemed to be going back on his original research. No, it was actually in 2010. He was on a BBC Radio 4 program, which is on. I've got a copy of that on my website, or a portion of it, in 2010. And he was like going back on his original research in the book and saying, oh, it was a mistake and he didn't really think that anymore and blah, blah, blah. So, but if you look at the Hump Zero Point book, there's some pretty significant stuff in that. And he also made this 2-part documentary called $1 Billion Secret, which again is available online. I've got that linked on the front page of my website as well. So it's really worth watching that documentary if you haven't seen it. It's very compelling stuff.
The documentary is called $1 Billion Secret as well?
Correct, yeah. So the $1 Billion Secret documentary came before the book was published, and I think he sort of went on this road trip across the USA, made the documentary with, I think, Channel 5 in the UK, maybe even Discovery Channel, I can't remember, and they just showed it on Channel 5 at that time. I'm pretty sure it's been shown on Discovery Channel, this documentary. And then he released the book in 2000, The Hunt for Zero Point. And it covers quite a lot of areas, such as the alleged Nazi projects into, an anti-gravity device called the Bell, or it appeared to have anti-gravity effects for it, even if it wasn't designed for that purpose.
This is the Nazi Bell, is that correct?
The Nazi Bell, it's called, and there's quite a lot of information, about that, some of which, I don't know, may just be outright disinformation, I'm not sure. But Nick Cook discusses this character called Hans Kammler, who was, one of these military bureaucrats, and he ended up being in charge of a lot of the weapons development programs, and it was alleged that they had a super secret ring-fenced program developed, which was developing this, these war-winning weapons, and part of which was done in underground, and I think it's a base called the Mittelwerk, I think it was called, where they built some of the V2 rockets and so on. So if you watch the documentary from 1999, and more latterly the one that Nick Cook did in 2005, which I don't think was as good. He watered some of that down, and he admitted to, when I wrote to him, he sort of admitted to me some of it did get watered down a bit. So again, sort of form your own views of that. But what Nick Cook pointed out, and others have pointed this out as well, with the anti-gravity research, was that it was all the aerospace companies were talking about anti-gravity devices and, engines of some kind or propulsion up until about 1956. And, they're exchanging, areas of research and so on, talking about areas of research. And then it suddenly seemed to become, in 1956, never going to work. It all went underground, and then it was just ridiculed from there on. And Thomas Townsend Brown had, around the same time, had developed this Project Winterhaven document, which is available on the internet, and it doesn't exactly talk about anti-gravity research, but it alludes to certain techniques which might be used. If you read this document, it's quite an interesting document. Again, there are PDFs on the internet. So it would appear that the black programs appeared to get going round about in the mid-50s, which of course, if we consider the aftermath of the alleged crash at Roswell, which I would say did actually happen, and I believe something very exotic did crash there, and it would appear from everything that I've researched that, you know, bodies were recovered and stuff. I mean, where it came from and whose technology it was, I mean, I don't really know. I don't know if anybody really knows, but I think it was a real incident. Real technology came out of it. And if you then, you know, have an 8-year gap between 47 and 55, that's a sort of sensible length of time for them to start to build up these programs and try and kind of, you know, give some direction to them and so on, and build up a secrecy apparatus, which I think was being done after Truman signed the National Security Act I think it was in 47 as well.
So yesterday I was listening to your over 3 or 4 hour interviews with Edgar Fouché. I haven't listened to all of them,
right?
But I know that Edgar Fouché worked at Area 51, and he had experience with this aircraft that he calls the TR-3B, which he says relies on something called magnetic field disruption. How is it that you got to be interested in Edgar Fouché and his research, and how did you get in touch with him?
Yeah, well, that's you know, we were discussing just before we started recording. It's sort of a ironic story in some ways. I put together this presentation in 2004, which, you know, I've been quoting some of it as we've been going along and so on. And Edgar Fouché actually appeared in another 1999 documentary which was broadcast in the UK called Riddle of the Skies. And he'd been interviewed by people who claimed to be from the BBC. He was interviewed actually for about 6 hours, but they ended up using 3 minutes from his testimony. And he was a career military from the late 60s, and he had a lot of experience both working in the military itself and as a contractor. And he had expertise in cryptography, that's, you know, code breaking, code making, in the equipment they used for that. And he got heavily involved in that area and had a top secret clearance for doing that sort of work. He was working on very sensitive equipment, and he built up a reputation for being a very competent and a very effective worker. He was able to solve problems and do it efficiently. And he gathered a sort of group of people around him that were also, he could work with. And so what happened was, in 1979, by then he'd been working in the military for probably, I think, 12 or 13 years, and he had quite a bit of experience. And the difference with Edgar Fouché is he's shown me some of the documents, like he's shown me some of the certificates that he completed, these various courses. He kept over 900 documents, and he had a selection which he showed to the Channel 4 team, and he showed them to me as well, or some of them, and I put some of these in the YouTube videos that I've done with Ed Fouché. So I'm pretty convinced he's a 100% genuine guy, and he'll tell his story as to why he decided to, bring out the information that he did. But he ended up working in Area 51 in 79, and he was servicing some equipment, and he noticed that this equipment he was servicing had very advanced electronics, and it was actually one of the boards that he pulled out of the rack to fix or to test to see if that was the part that was broken, had a very advanced VLSI chip, very large scale integration, that is, chip. And when he tested it with his oscilloscope and his frequency counter, it was clocking up 1 gigahertz. So it's like it had a 1 gigahertz processor. And this board was working with a satellite system, and he was looking at the signal that this board was generating, and it was the type of signal that it was generating was the signal that you would use for modulating voice communications. So this meant that there was voice communications going up to the satellite, or something up in space in 79, and he wondered who they were actually talking to up there, because this was NSA essentially technology that he was handling. And he also saw at that time around. He was there for 10 days, I think, over 2 weeks. Because he was assigned because somebody else had gone on leave for a bereavement, and so he was covering for them. And he explains all of this in the video. And he basically overheard various conversations talking about quasi-crystals and various advanced aircraft that were in Area 51, and he ended up seeing one of these one day parked on the tarmac. It was a triangular-shaped craft, and it was huge. He explains this in the video how he saw it, and he saw it out of the corner of his goggles. Obviously he was very curious to see this thing, and he obviously knew that he couldn't disclose anything, and he couldn't really talk to anybody about it, not openly at least. But I think it was essentially over the next 20 years, or maybe slightly less than 20 years, up until about 1995. I think he retired from the Air Force in around about 1995. And he started to try and find out more from contacts that he had within the people that dealt with the Air Force and their systems. And he eventually found out bits and pieces of information that this, people did know about this craft, and it used this, as you said, this principle of magnetic field disruption, which was some way of actually reducing the effects of gravity on the craft, and it reduced the effects of gravity by 89%. So the craft was 89% lighter than it should have been for something of that mass, essentially. And it could make very rapid maneuvers in the sky, and it was actually, he thought, used for transporting equipment and supplies. It was 600 feet across, this thing. It was huge, I think the prototype was about 150 feet or possibly 300 feet. But this was a huge, huge craft, much bigger than a jumbo jet, for example. And he talked to various people that I think had sort of knew various bits and pieces about this. Some knew about the stealth technology that he employed. Some knew about the propulsion, which the propulsion was an engine at each corner which used nuclear thermal propulsion, which was developed in the 50s. And you can go and look that up. It was, that's something that Stanton Friedman actually worked on. The NERVA program, I think it's called, nuclear engine rocket vehicle, I think it was called. And so he then decided in 1998 to disclose that information, and he put together a presentation, and he spoke at the International UFO Congress, I think, for the first time.
Right, and didn't he disclose his experiences in 1998?
That's correct, yeah.
So has there been any backlash for his exposing this secret technology?
Well, initially I think he had some minor bits of hassle. He said that, like, for example, when he was in the hotel in the International UFO Congress, or one of those events, I can't remember which particular one, he did about 2 or 3 close together, and his hotel room was broken into and stuff was strewn around. What he'd done is, he did have some documents, but what he'd done is he kind of made copies of them and then scrubbed out some of the names and stuff like that and retyped them, and then he destroyed the originals. So, he didn't actually have any original secret documents in his possession. And so, he wasn't really, I think, as far as the people that were after him were concerned, that what he was putting out was they had plausible deniability for it. They could just deny it, more easily, because he didn't have the original documents of the stuff that he was talking about. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he was very careful how he did it. I think what was quite interesting to me when I came across Edgar Fouché is that a lot of people repeated what he'd said, but they didn't really mention him. They were using his information without giving him credit. And indeed, very recently, there was a History Channel documentary called Hangar 1, the Hangar 1 Files. They've had a series of where they're, dramatising the opening up of these MUFON files, which is the Mutual UFO Network. And I think program number 2 or 3 in this series was about the secret space program, which, of course, this is where this leads to ultimately.
Wow. Well, I actually have not seen this, but we'll be right back. And I'm with Andrew Johnson from checktheevidence.com. All right. I'm back with Andrew Johnson, and we are talking about Edgar Fouché, anti-gravity technology, and Andrew was just discussing this show on History Channel called History One Files. What is this show about, Andrew?
Yeah, right. Well, it's called the Hanger One Files actually, but yeah, that's fine. Hanger One Files, and they're basically opening up these MUFON files, and one of the MUFON files was about the secret space program, essentially, or areas where people seem to have come across parts of that. And this is something I mentioned in my presentation as well, of course. But there was this whole segment on the TR-3B in a recent program, which I think was only broadcast 2 or 3 weeks ago, and Edgar Fouché highlighted this to me that it was going to be on. But guess what? I managed to watch this and I watched through the whole thing, 42 minutes. They talked quite a bit about the TR-3B and the magnetic field disruptor and some of the details you and I have just mentioned. This triangular craft, the TR-3B is, with a light at each corner and one in the centre, 89% reduction in weight and so on. But guess what? The History Channel documentary did not once mention Edgar Fouché's name. Not once, which I thought was extremely peculiar because all of that information was disclosed by him in 1998.
So it seems that there are entities that have taken the information that he has disclosed and they try to take ownership of his work, essentially.
Well, it certainly looks like that. Whether they're trying to connect this, maybe it's the case that the TR-3B isn't necessarily a space-faring vehicle. It may just be used within the atmosphere to move things at high speed in stealth. And it's very efficient at doing that. And it may be not used for any other purpose. So it's possible that they've tried to associate this description with the secret space program, but in actuality, the stuff that they've got in the secret space program is something significantly different from that. I don't know. That's just a guess. I don't, it's speculation on my part. I think it's going back to Edgar Fouché himself. It's worth describing how he and I ended up coming into contact because, of course, as we were discussing earlier, that goes right back to 9/11. Which also has this strange and peculiar anti-gravity element to it, which I didn't really become aware of until Dr. Judy Wood's research into this became more public, or at least to me, or became known to me in 2007. And we've got these accounts, for example, of David Hansher, the New York Daily News photographer, being levitated and carried a block. Rennie Davler experiencing this strange force going inside his bag. We've got this, Blaise Pasquale, I think his name is, who was apparently kind of floated down 20 floors in the World Trade Center or something. And other people reporting their hats flying off, some of the firefighters, upturned trucks, upturned ambulances, one guy diving under a truck and then the tower coming down, and then the next minute the truck's blown off him.
Well, to add to your examples, from the book Where Did the Towers Go by Dr. Judy Wood, I remember reading there was a car found on top of another car that was not showing the characteristic of rolling or moving in a damaging way, but seemingly floated right on top of the other car.
Right, that's it. I mean, you've got various examples like that. And we've seen the pictures of the cars that are upside down, and the one that comes to my mind quickly is the in front of World Financial Center building number 1, I think it is, and you've got this one car the right way up, the other car upside down, and the next car the right way up again. So this can only be some type of levitation effect when you look at all the evidence. It can't be a wind effect. It's extremely peculiar. And so this original presentation that I'd done, I updated it, I think, in 2010 or something, because I'd been asked to talk about it at another conference or something. And so I included some of that information that you've just described there, what I knew of that. And of course, it was around the same time that this Edgar Fouché has kind of reappeared on the internet, because we didn't discuss what happened to Ed after 1998, and that he did, I don't know, a few talks in the States, did the interview for Channel 4, and I think he was sort of talking, he was speaking out for a couple of years, and then for example his house was broken into, and he had a few other problems, and his car was broken into as well, I believe, and stuff strewn around inside of it. And so he decided that he was just going to move and, just not talk about this anymore. And he basically sort of went off, wasn't not seen of until 2010. And then I came across him on YouTube, and he was basically saying that he was hooked up with this alien scientist, Jeremy Riss is apparently his real name, we think. We're not 100% sure, but it appears to be his real name. And he was on Alien Scientists' website and forum and posting stuff on there and talking about alien scientists. And I wrote to Edgar Fouché at that time and I said, look, this guy is certainly not being truthful about 9/11. He appears to be part of the cover-up of the connection between energy technology and therefore probably the anti-gravity technology as well. And Edgar Fouché wrote back to me at that time and said, well, okay, but he's putting my information on there. He hasn't messed that up, and he was quite neutral about it. But later on, Edgar Fouché was attacked by the alien scientist Jeremy Riss, and he put these ultra remarks on Edgar Fouché's biography page that he had on his website. You can look at all of this in the Internet Archive and so on. It was, I think, late last year or early this year, late 2013, that Edgar Fouché got in touch with me and said, I may have misjudged this alien scientist character, because he started attacking me and calling me a disinfo artist and so on, which was totally unwarranted, and Ed explained to me the circumstances under which that had happened and said, why don't we just talk for a bit? And I said, yeah, no problem. And he very kindly agreed to do a whole set of interviews to lay out all of his story, just about, or well, maybe not all of it, but a good chunk of it at least, which gives people a great opportunity to decide, whether he's telling the truth about his disclosures. And I checked up on quite a lot of what he was saying in terms of the aircraft technology that he was talking about, and some of the systems that were on those aircraft that he worked on, and I certainly couldn't find anything that was just made up. All of it, as I understood it, was totally correct and accurate. So that just made me sure that he was telling the truth. But it was ironic that this alien scientist, Jeremy Riss, still has on his website my original 2004 presentation, which I just sat, on my computer and read through it on PowerPoint kind of thing. It wasn't anything. I just did it to document it. I didn't really try and do it to be, kind of create anything sort of fancy. And alien scientist said that it was this presentation which he'd ended up watching, which had inspired him to start his own research and ultimately to start his own YouTube channel, I suppose, which became very, very popular, and he got tens of thousands of subscribers apparently. But so there it was, that it come full circle in 9 or 10 years, and I was speaking to the very man that had disclosed this information in 98. So how strange is that?
So essentially, alien scientist admitted that you were intrinsic in his starting the YouTube channel and talking about these technologies.
Well, yeah, influential, apparently, yeah. You can read it on his own words on his channel, and I only found this quite recently. But yeah, as he wouldn't, when I wrote this article about him called Alien Scientist and His Alien Science, he would not accept the criticism that I made about the 9/11 research that he put up there about, as we were discussing earlier, he would not talk about the connection between cold fusion, what's called cold fusion effects, and the World Trade Center evidence. He would not talk about that at all. which to me was highly suspicious because the connections are so blindingly obvious.
Well, that brings me to another point that alien scientist seems to have addressed, but he seems to be quite unconvinced of John Hutchison's work. He did an entire video describing the effect of John Hutchison, describing Hutchison as a theoretical physicist. But then he goes on to dismiss that any of the reports of the Hutchison effect are true. He seems to be able to accept that there are low energy nuclear reactions in cold fusion, but Jeremy Riss seems to not be able to make that connection to 9/11 and certain seemingly low energy nuclear reactions that we see at ground zero.
Right. That appears to be the case, and one has to ask the question why. Well, I certainly do, and it appears to be that he's trying to protect Stephen E. Jones and the interest that he has in keeping the truth about both cold fusion, which is a big enough sort of phenomenon in itself, really hugely important. And I would say that Dr. Eugene Mallove, who tried to bring out this information into a more credible forum, that's why I think Eugene Mallove was murdered in 2004. Obviously I can't prove that, but it looks rather suspicious if you look into the timing of that murder. And Stephen E. Jones worked in cold fusion, and then he appears in 9/11 research in 2005, just after the NIST reports came out. Jones tried to say that Pons and Fleischmann, shouldn't have called it fusion. Well, that's kind of strange because it was Jones that actually called it fusion. He came up with the cold fusion terminology, and he tried to label Pons and Fleischmann's work as the same as his when it wasn't. It was a different process. And Pons and Fleischmann did probably use the word fusion to describe what might be the cause of some of the effects that they saw in their experiments. But by about 1990 or 91, they kind of backed off that idea because they then sort of thought it was some other nuclear effect that was going on, which wasn't necessarily fusion. It was some other type of nuclear reaction. So Jones has been disingenuous when he characterises those things, and I've written all that up fairly extensively, particularly in view of some recent or more recent communications I had earlier this year, which people can read about on my website if they wanted to do that.
So in the same way that Stephen Jones was found to be covering up cold fusion, it seems that Jeremy Riss, also known as alien scientist, is trying to cover up the Hutchison effect.
That seems to be the case, because my take, to go back to that specific thing, was that he seemed to make some videos before he became aware of the connection to 9/11 and Judy Wood about John Hutchison. He seemed to make some quite complimentary videos about John, because I think he mentions his research in more than one video, and I think he made some video about some theoretical process which would explain anti-gravity effects, that have been observed by Tesla or something. And then in that video, he mentioned the research of John Hutchison to say, his is another example of this same effect, or something like that. I can't remember the specifics. But then later on, he said that John Hutchison is a quack. That the video that I critiqued, in that video, he said, John Hutchison is a quack. And I thought, well, that's a bit of a turnaround. And the turnaround seemed to happen as soon as the connection was made to 9/11, which was exactly what happened with Ace Baker a year or two prior to that. So I'd agree with you. He seems to be attempting to muddle up or cover up the Hutchison effect connection to 9/11, which is, of course, laid out in Dr. Judy Wood's book quite powerfully.
So it seems that alien scientist is speaking out of both sides of his mouth. In one instance, he supports John Hutchison. On the other instance, John Hutchison is completely a quack and not trustworthy. But I think that the Hutchison effect is clearly proven. George Hathaway actually was a prominent scientist, engineer, who actually tried to reproduce the Hutchison effect. I wanted to read a little quote here from a book called T.T. Brown's Electrogravitics Research. This is put out by the Integrity Research Institute. It says here, in 1980, George Hathaway, a professional engineer licensed in Canada, formed a small company to develop and promote what is referred to as the Hutchison effect. It is named after its inventor, John Hutchison, who liked to experiment with combinations of Tesla coils and Van de Graaff generators at the same time. More of the information about the lift and disruption effects has been reported at previous conferences. Videotapes of much of the phenomena have been shown as well. Hathaway recently assembled a 3-hour videotape which documents the TV interviews, reports, and actual events. And you've also alluded to Nick Cook's experience with the Hutchison effect, and Nick Cook was told by Boyd Bushman that this is something that he needs to pay attention to as far as new technology and secret technology. What have you seen from reactions towards the Hutchison effect that people like alien scientists have commented on?
Well, that's it. I mean, they say the flak is strongest when you're over the target, and that appears to be the case with the Hutchison effect in terms of it's actually more important than you might first think, because it appears to be, if you read the book that I wrote, 9/11 Finding the Truth, or look at the articles on my website individually, you'll find that there was a whole set of efforts in 2008 primarily to try and discredit John Hutchison. Apparently because of the connection of the evidence to what happened at the World Trade Center. I mean, that's certainly what I saw in the evidence that was presented to me in terms of the reactions of people like Ace Baker and Jim Fetzer, and probably several other people that I could mention if I cared to go back in my mind to that time. An alien scientist was another one, as we sort of more or less discussed. And he did seem to be trying to minimise the significance of the Hutchison effect in relation to its connection to the events of 9/11. If you look at the effects that John has created at various times, sometimes all together, sometimes individually, he's able to levitate samples. He's able to cause the jellification or kind of deformation of metals without heat. He creates transmutation of elements. He has effects which seem to last in materials, longer than, it's like it almost materials start to sort of decompose after he's used them as experimental samples. In other words, whatever effects he generates can be ongoing, after the experiment is finished. And he has these weird fires, which occur in some of the samples. There's a boat video which he gave us that he filmed when he was trying to reproduce this alleged Philadelphia experiment. So at the World Trade Center, for example, we had these weird fires where paper was burning, metal appeared to be burning, but the paper next to it wasn't.
So weird fires would denote the aspect that heat is not seeming to be active in the same way that it would be with a campfire, so to speak.
Exactly. It seems to be like perhaps even a cold fire. Now, it could be that, as Dr. Wood observes, that when these fires, they start off strangely. In other words, they start off as cold fires or some type of material change that looks like a fire, and it may be they evolve into real fires quite quickly, in just a few seconds or minutes. But at certain points, it appears that they don't behave like real fires, as seen from the non-burning paper and so on.
And particularly with levitation, the Hutchison effect is very well known for the levitation aspect. It's called a lift and disruption effect.
Right.
We see the jellification, we see the transmutation, which would describe the disruption, but the lift aspect is very interesting in the sense of electrogravitics research. Most electrogravitics function with some sort of a charged capacitor, electrostatic fields being combined. But it seems that the Hutchison effect, as I've read in this electrogravitics book, it's actually taking a DC electrostatic field and combining it with an AC electrostatic field. And this creates an interference that will cause objects to thrust upward.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've probably studied it a little bit more than I have, and that's good. And I think it is important to sort of look at the characteristics that you described there, DC and AC fields, and as you sort of, I think, were saying, the Thomas Townsend Brown experiments primarily use just electrostatic fields, and I don't think they ever tried sort of beaming in radio frequency energy as John Hutchison's done, or microwaves or anything like that. So that's why they perhaps observed one set of effects, which was primarily the levitation effects, and John has seen both the levitation and these other effects on materials. And I think it's something that Nick Cook mentions in his book, that these effects on gravity and free energy and on materials are all interrelated. So when you start to tweak with these energy systems in a certain way, that's when you get these effects popping out. Like if you spin your equipment at high speed or use high frequency oscillations of waves, this is something which is common to many of these experiments, where you seem to perhaps be tweaking or stroking or fiddling with the underlying fabric of reality, and these other effects seem to pop out. That's what appears to be a common theme.
And it seems that we've always understood in science that electricity interacts very closely with magnetism. And if it is true, as Edgar Fouché says, that they have an anti-gravity machine that functions with magnetic field disruption, it seems that there is a relationship between magnetism and gravity. So how is it that we're not seeing more of these effects with our electronic devices? Why is it limited, do you think, to people like John Hutchison or George Pigott?
Well, I don't think these effects are particularly easy to create. John worked for 20 years to actually perfect his technique. And so I think it's something that's very, you wouldn't just stumble across it accidentally. And I think when you use these fields in isolation, when you've only got an electric field and you've only got a magnetic field and they're not really doing much together, you're not trying to kind of interfere the various frequencies and so on, or different types of energy, then you're not going to see these effects. And I think it's because John was using these multiple types of energy in one place, in one region, that's why he began to see these effects. He was perhaps wondering what he'd heard about the effects with magnetic fields, but perhaps he didn't realise that you could mix together electrostatic effects as well. What he was trying to do was, as I understand it, he'd been trying to reproduce some of the effects seen by Nikola Tesla in his experiments, and that's what he was aiming for, to see if he could generate these large sort of electrostatic fields and so on, and see what effects he could generate with that. And I think it's from there, as he was seeing certain anomalous effects. For example, if you look at the people that have done the research into these lifters, they appear also to be able to create some strange effects just with high voltage electricity alone.
Well, we have seen today that there is certainly a lot of secret technology in the field of anti-gravity. We've seen that obviously there is a relation here to 9/11. So, thank you, Andrew, for coming on the show today, and thank you for having this conversation.
Well, you're very welcome, Ryan. Thanks for hosting it.